So another important metafictional strategy that we see in Middlesex are the several intertextual allusions that occur, which allows Middlesex to work in a very palimpsestic manner, pulling on the motifs and plots of these other texts. For instance, we have an overt reference to Herculean Barber, which also connects to Foucault and Butler, who both use this text to explore gender. And there are parallels in the stories. For instance, we have two figures who are raised in feminine spaces. One's a convent, the other is an all-girls boarding school, who go through puberty and then write about the experiences they had once they realized that they were intersexed. We also have Madame Butterfly playing at one point in the text, which introduces the idea of race differences, and of course a savvy reader will connect in Butterfly and Madame Butterfly together. And then you have T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland that makes a few appearances in this text, which is interesting because it gestures towards Greek folklore with the image of Tiresias, and as the narrator compares himself within the wasteland to Tiresias. And then we also have a gesture outside of the text because it mentions that Mr. Eugenides, who's in fact our author, will be reading an excerpt from The Wasteland in Smyrna. And again, this does exactly what metafiction typically strives to do and breaks the fictional frame and turns us back to the real world within which we're situated, and to be aware of the construction of the narration. And of course, that then ties in very well with historiography. Scott Cohen claims that Cal is a narrator and character, Greek and American, woman and man. As such, in her/him also collide the patriarchal perspective that sees life in terms of historical progression, i.e. linear, and the matriarchal understanding of life in cyclical terms. So again, if we return to Hayden White, who talks about the construction of history, stating narrative becomes a problem only when we wish to give real events the form of a story. It is because real events do not offer themselves as stories that their narrativization is so difficult. We have to recognize that history is a rhetorical construction, and therefore we need to be quite aware of who is speaking it. And Cal here is unique because he's both objective and subjective. He's experienced both genders, and he's experienced being multicultural. So this gives our narrative a very complex hybrid experience. And Cal says other things get passed down too, motifs, scenarios, even fates. In other words, that the way we speak about history, the narratives that we talk about history can also affect the way that we behave in the future. And as a result, gender and sex are shown to be historical constructions, narratives that have particular rhetorical purposes within particular historical moments. And Cohen cautions us, we have to be aware that Cal is somewhat unreliable because he has his own motivations for writing a historiography. The story of the past is the story of the present. The truth of past events is not something we can capture, and it's always colored by present day needs. And so in Cal's instance, the history that he provides is motivated by his own concerns. And Cal would agree with that. Living since a person not into the future but back into the past, the stories we tell ourselves are significant because they color the way we see our present. And of course, the first two books are the most overtly concerned with historiography, with Desdemona and Lucky in Smyrna, and then on the boat, and then in Detroit. And what these two books do is demonstrate possibilities for transformation, as well as the ways in which our constructions of the past bear on our experience of the future, because Desdemona and Lucky are able to reconstruct their past, creating a false past, and therefore a future based on a false narrative, that both is happy and presented as somewhat dangerous. You know, Cal's condition is a direct result of this reconstruction of their connection from brother and sister to husband and wife. And that also ties into the way that we view the American dream. And through Cal, things that are presented in some histories as bright and positive are shown in terms of decay and disillusion. Indeed, Cal is a revisionist historian, so we look at things like the port authorities mistreating immigrants, or the Ford melting pot English school, which within one narrative of the past would be seen as a way of helping people to the American dream, but in Cal's version, we see this is really a destructive act intended to erase difference and deny difference. And we also see the African American ghetto of Detroit, which Cal mentions is not spoken of initially, but it's a truth that people tend to overlook. We also see in this kind of historiographic bent that gender then is presented as a very fluid narrative. In the 50s and 60s, we see quite a different attitude from, say, Desdemona and Lucky in Smyrna, and in Detroit in the 20s and 30s, where they had separate spaces for the genders, and then in the next generation that breaks down a little bit more. And then, of course, in chapter 11 in Cal's generation, you have this counter movement and women's liberation and all of that, which then starts showing that gender is not historically entrenched, that it can change, and of course Cal states it was possible that no generation other than my brothers was as well disposed to accept me. So gender has its own history that's in constant flux. And then finally we have this idea that the text is powerful, that to actually write a story down gives it weight and permanence, but it also makes it open to interpretation. So we have Callie's psychological narratives, her first efforts at writing down her experience, but these are fictionalized accounts. She's trying to give the doctor what he needs, but this has negative impacts in some ways because it damages the reliability of that information for the scientific community. And then we have the actual medical report in which they claim that Callie is more of a man than she is a woman, and we see that scientific knowledge has great weight, and we've debated whether or not this is why she embraces becoming a man. We also see Webster's dictionary, which defines hermaphrodites in connection to monsters, although this is problematized. Cohen points out the fact that Cal makes everybody in the text post-human by saying after 1913 people are only cogs in Henry Ford's assembly line. So the dictionary is given both weight by the young Cal and is also troubled by the Cal who is revising history. And then finally we have Cal's note in which he declares that I'm not a girl. It's a confession. This is the turning point. This is when he embraces the changes, when he actually puts the pen to paper and makes that claim. But it's also worth noting that it's on hotel stationery. And of course a hotel is a transitional space. So conclusions. Linda Hutchins states that the personal is the political, then the traditional separation between private and public history must be rethought. So again, where Shostak and Cohen seem to find fault in the text, I think is that the text itself should be the response to them, that if it seems artificial that Cal embraces being a man and that's a forced uplift at the end, I think it's actually that the text is successful because it's a narrative act that itself preserves that hybrid intersex nature. Within a printed space, Cal remains both female and male. His experience is preserved in the act of writing. And Cal himself states, a strange new possibility is arising, compromised, indefinite, but not entirely obliterated. Free will is making a comeback. Biology gives you a brain. Life turns it into a mind. And I think that's what this text does by constantly self-gesturing and making the reader think about the reading experience and the ways in which we construct narratives and construct our histories. That's what the text is encouraging us to expand our minds and to understand um, that that narratives can have more expansive construction. So, as I say here, by undermining traditional binaries related to race and gender and the historical narratives that perpetuate them, Eugenides creates a textual third space for readers to consider a possible world in which hybrid subjectivities can dwell. So, by forcing us to examine our literary conventions and their shortcomings and their reliance on binaries, um, this text succeeds in making us look to our literary past and consider a new narrative future, and therefore it's successful. Thank you for your time.